framework I use, actually, which is conveniently on my on my background behind me. And I use this. So this framework is called the behavioral lens. And so the lens has four parts. The first part is the idea of loss. So L is for loss, and loss is really the notion of how the prospect of a loss affects our choices. And this works in many ways. You'll be very familiar with loss aversion. It was one of the sort of important parts of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's idea of prospect theory. But really, loss works in many ways. Loss can motivate us to do something. If we feel that there is a prospect of losing it, we might want to grab it now. This is how the scarcity effect works, for example.
Yeah.
But loss can also, and I think for marketers, one of the most important conversations I have with people is how the prospect of loss may stop people from doing things. So one of the things that I do in my workshops, and actually I kind of have a section on in my book, is I get people to think about what might people fear losing that stops them from adopting the behavior they want to make. When I help organizations design research, I'm asking them to probe that sort of to get into this area of trying to find out what might be left, what people might fear leaving behind, what people might fear losing, what comfort they may feel that they are giving up by adopting the choice we want them to make. There's a great quote from Ron Heifetz, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he talks about people, he says, people aren't change averse. What they are is loss averse, because in every change, there is a potential loss. And so this is an important thing for us to take into account, because what we're trying to do nearly always in marketing is we're trying to, very often we're asking people to do something new, or to stop doing something they're doing already, or even if we're asking them to continue doing something, there's a potential loss involved in simply saying, keeping up, you're potentially giving up something by continuing doing the same thing. So that's the first part of the lens. The second is ease. And this is something we all know about, which is, we all take the easiest path to do things. The reason I'm carrying more pounds than I should be, the reason I haven't finished writing something that I should have been writing, and the reason I've got 20 books on my Kindle that I'm only 7% through is because it's easier to not do those things. And Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, and I say behavioral economist because he comes from an economics background, I think he has a great quote, which is, he says he learned two things in his book, Misbehaving. He says, I've learned two things working with practitioners. And one of them, the first one he talks about is that if you want someone to do something, make it easy. And it is so embedded in human nature to sort of follow that easy pathway. And this affects choice in a number of ways. We will often bypass a decision that seems difficult because there is an easier route that means we don't have to go there. Or we will simply put something off because it seems too difficult. But just this notion of kind of making something easy, again, this is not just physical ease. In my perspective, or from my perspective, ease covers many, many different things. Ease covers, of course, the idea, there was a study done a number of years ago that showed that when an ice cream cabinet was closed, sales went down, I can't remember the exact percentage, 10 or 20%. When it's opened back up again, the sales come back just from that simple thing of the cabinet, partly the effort of the cabinet being closed. Maybe perhaps a closed cabinet sends out signals. It kind of helps reinforce your strength in not taking an ice cream. But certainly there's an aspect of ease there. And but cognitive ease is also an incredibly important thing. One of the things that sort of Byron Sharp talks a lot about is about sort of brands being mentally available. Mental availability is a form of ease. If you are more mentally available than somebody else, it is easier to bring that brand to mind. If the associations that you have fit together more easily, if the brand narrative fits together more easily, it becomes an easier brand to make a choice about. Itamar Simonson, who's a professor at Stanford, wrote a book called Absolute Value. One of the things he talks about is how we're addicted to comparisons. And one of the reasons for this is that it's very difficult to make a choice in isolation. We're always looking for reference points from which to make choices. And if you can create reference points that help people, guide people towards a choice you want them to make, you are making that choice easier. It's kind of the way we look at things. It's we don't look at everything we see and say, what is that? And try to build a mental model for it from the ground up. We can say, what's that like that I know already? Because that is easier. We don't need to do the work of constructing something. We already have that model in our heads. And so, another part of ease is how do you create the right comparisons that will help you achieve your objectives? So ease has many, 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 many aspects. The N stands for now and near. So it should be a double N, but that kind of started to get kind of funky. But now and near are related. I mean, now is temporal proximity. Really, this is the notion of how time and our perceptions of time, how distance affect the choices we make, how they affect how we see things, how we factor those things into our decision making. There's a great area of which relates to manners of distance called construal level theory. Construal level theory is the idea that when things have lesser or greater social distance, physical distance or temporal distance, we regard them quite differently. And that can be, as a marketer, that can be very helpful. I would say that for luxury brands, you actually want to create that distance. That distance is a good thing. There's the idea that sort of, I have to work to understand this brand, to become an expert on it, actually works very well for luxury brands. It doesn't work so well for the brands that we use on a day-to-day basis for more functional things. And then S stands for self and social, or social and self. And that is really how other people and ourselves affect our choices. Very simply, you're very familiar, and your listeners and viewers will be very familiar with the idea of social proof, which is how the behavior of others actually sort of affects our choices, how we see things. One of the stories you talked about bird watching earlier on, but one of the stories I like to tell about this is how if you're imagine you're trying to get close to a group of shorebirds or waders. Now, these are notoriously difficult species to identify because they often look very similar. And so as you get closer, trying to work out whether, if I was at home in San Francisco, whether they are least sandpipers or western sandpipers, it's very frustrating because you sort of get within 40 yards of them, 30 yards, one flies away. And then a couple of seconds later, another one flies away, and then suddenly the whole flock go. But what's happening there is very interesting because the first one saw me and thought I was dangerous. The second one saw me, but the remainder were reacting to the behavior of the others. We are driven not just by the potential reward or the potential threat, but what we perceive as other people's behavior around that. And self is really important as well, because how we feel about ourselves, how we want to project ourselves, is incredibly important in focusing our choices. And you mentioned the Woody Allen quote earlier on about us being defined by our choices. There's a great, I did a workshop a number of years ago that Jonah Berger was talking at. And one of the things he talked about is how our choices are communication. I think that's a really insightful way of putting things, because it's the idea that sort of I'm telling you things about myself by the choices that I've made. And, sort of what's important there from a marketing perspective is to ensure that the choice you want people to make aligns with their self-concept, with how they feel about themselves, how they want to project themselves. Because when a thought doesn't align with your self-concept, when a choice doesn't align with your self-concept, you are much less likely to make it.